Welcome to Disunion, the Government Union Report, the podcast where we delve into the ever-evolving landscape of public sector labor policy and law. I'm your host, David R. Osborne, and I'm excited to be your guide through the complex world of government unionization. We bring in experts and individuals with hands-on experience navigating the challenges and opportunities surrounding the unionization of government employees. From the latest legal developments to the practical insights that shape the policies, we've got it covered. So get ready to gain a deeper understanding of the newsmaking issues that impact public sector labor policy across the nation. My guest today is Christian Barnard. He's Assistant Director of Education Reform at Reason Foundation. And his focus there is on research and analysis of state education and school district finance systems with the goal of making them more equitable and innovative. He previously worked with the Foundation for Government Accountability and the Pioneer Institute. And for Pennsylvania natives, he holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Messiah College, just outside Harrisburg. Hi, Christian. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so I reached out to Christian because of an article that he wrote that appeared on Education Next. And the title of the piece is States Are Bad at Giving Teachers Raises. So Christian, can you tell us what you mean by that?
What I mean is that, every state leader, every president ever, every governor of every state has always bemoaned teacher pay and talked about, wanting to prioritize teachers and wanting to make sure their salaries are competitive. And yet, what's interesting is that as more money has flowed into education, a surprisingly small share has made it into teacher salaries. And so what made me interested in that was, what explains why teacher salaries are not growing, especially with the increasing education investments? And so at Reason, we just released a comprehensive study of federal data, financial and performance data and staffing data between 2002 and 2020 for every state with inflation-adjusted figures. And what we saw was that, education spending, every education revenues has increased by 25%, and yet teacher salaries are flat. They've actually declined in inflation-adjusted terms by 0.6%.
So why would that be?
So there's a couple reasons. One of the main reasons is that benefit costs are rising sharply. And so new education dollars that are being funneled into the K-12 system, public school system, are largely being diverted to benefit costs as opposed to instructional salaries. So one summary data point I wrote about in the piece is that for every $1 that went to instructional salary spending, 4 went to benefit costs. And now when we talk about benefit costs, we're talking about obviously unemployment insurance and healthcare, but the big one is retirement benefits. So most states have for their public school teachers, and new dollars largely go to paying down those rising costs, especially in states with large unfunded liabilities and pension debt. So that's the major reason, I would say, the biggest reason why new education dollars aren't actually going to salaries. It's because they're going to compensation that is non-salaries, increasingly so. The other big reason is there's a staffing surge in public education. So new education dollars are largely being prioritized to hire new staff rather than give raises to existing public school teachers. So another summary data point there is that the teacher workforce grew at about the same rate as enrollment, around 7% over the roughly 2-decade period, but non-teaching staff grew by 20%. And non-teaching staff now outnumber teachers. And I'll add to that, this is not administrators. Of course, there are more administrators in public schools now, but administrators always compose a pretty small portion of public school staff. This is largely school-level support personnel, so people who are attendance officers or providing health, psychology, speech pathology, other kinds of services like that, food service workers, transportation. That's one of the big staffing surge categories. So again, to summarize, the two main reasons that new dollars aren't going to teacher salaries, despite it being a main priority of state and federal leaders, is that it's going to rising benefit costs in more staff.
So you mentioned something in the article about union stronghold states. And I saw several graphs that chart, what this looks like per state. It's spread out differently depending on the state. But what do you mean by union stronghold states? And then Tell me what's happening in those states and why it might have something to do with the unions themselves.
Yeah, well, David, I'll say you definitely know more about different ways of measuring union strength. But what I mean is just union density, the BLS union density measures. And as your Commonwealth Foundation report has noted, that's not the only way of measuring union strength. But a major question I had of, why these new dollars, I've explained where the dollars are going. And the question is, okay, well, how are these decisions about staffing and compensation, where are they being made? They're being made largely at the district level. And as we know, in states with more union-friendly policies, duty to bargain laws, and depending on the scope as well of what the state statute says about what districts have to bargain about before they make financial decisions with their local teachers union, I noted that, more union-dense states do seem to fare somewhat better at driving more dollars to teacher salaries, but none of them do it well. The national average is that each new dollar that goes to education, only 7 cents goes to instructional salaries. Now, you have some union-dense states like Massachusetts that's at the top of the list, so 34 cents of every new dollar goes to education. But you have others like California where there's only 6 cents of every new education dollar goes to instructional salaries. Pennsylvania is in that camp as well. Only 5 cents of every new dollar goes to instructional salaries. And so it's kind of a muddled relationship, I would say, between union density and dollars going to teacher raises. We know that teacher unions are good at getting more money for education, but how much do they actually prioritize that for teacher salaries as opposed to other purposes? And I would say nationally, no state really prioritizes dollars for teacher salaries.
That's fascinating. So when we're talking about unions, I mean, there are kind of two functions as far as teachers unions see themselves. Two functions. One is to be a representative, just like a trade union might be, or some other professional organization, a representative of their members at the General Assembly or the legislature. That's where you might drive up total overall spending on education. But then there's this second function where they do collective bargaining at the very local level. And that is where you'd be negotiating with a school board over salaries themselves. It almost sounds like maybe the unions are doing a good job on that first one. They're driving up spending. At least spending is way up, but not as good at the bargaining table of making sure that those dollars end up in teachers' pockets. Now, is that the union's fault at the bargaining table, or is that just how things, have to work at the school board level? Do they have too many things that have to be paid for?
There's blame to go around. And also, it's worth asking how big of a problem this really is. Another thing I found is that states that don't have as much union membership or union density, I know those are different, but say Florida or Arizona, they don't necessarily fare better at directing new dollars to teacher salaries either. So that suggests this is a problem that's systemic, and that union presence is kind of entering into an already weird system in public education where new dollars are often going to other purposes than just giving broad-based salary raises. I do think teachers are balancing priorities. They have decidedly mixed incentives. Clearly, they're going to want higher salaries for their members, but they also want more members. And on top of that, they want to preserve generous benefits for their members. And those different priorities can cut against each other depending on the context. So that's why there are some, union-friendly states like Massachusetts or New York to a lesser extent that do a relatively better job at driving dollars into the classroom. But then there are other states like California or Pennsylvania or New Jersey that do a very poor job at driving new money to instructional salaries. I think it's because they've balanced these priorities differently. And I'll also say that, to your point, that second function of teachers' unions to bargain at the district level, the scope of what they can bargain about is really important. They can get pretty prescriptive with everything about how schools operate and how they manage their budgets. And even if a district is at a place where they have declining enrollment and they need to restructure in order to say, give teachers raises or just be financially solvent, they might not have the latitude to do that in more union-friendly states.
Yeah, so you talked about some of the incentives for unions. And I guess before I ask that, it's worth noting that this gap, the supposed gap between salaries in unionized environments and non-unionized environments, at least in the educational world, seems to have more to do with a lot of external factors. I'm fascinated by this idea of, in Pennsylvania, for every dollar, you said 5 cents goes towards instructional salary. That's very interesting. So that maybe if the unions can drive up the overall spending high enough, it would actually end up affecting teacher salaries to some degree. But we're still talking about billions that are required to go into the funnel.
Yeah. So, I mean, they're good at securing more resources. That's for sure. And to return to the earlier point you made as well, about external factors, that is actually a very important point too here. The union stronghold states are also very wealthy states. Again, I mentioned New Jersey and New York, and you can throw in Connecticut and Massachusetts. Yeah, those states have union-friendly policies and high union density, but they also are wealthier, and they can afford to spend more and increase spending on education. They have healthier economies and higher taxation. There's research also examining this question of the chicken or the egg thing. So the chicken or the egg being, are higher spending states higher spending because they have more union strength, or do they have more union strength because they're higher spending and wealthier? So that's an important addition. I'm glad you brought that up.
Okay, back to the idea of competing incentives for teachers' unions. So one you named was adding more members. I did think, as you were telling us about non-teaching staff and some of the money going towards not administrators, but non-teaching staff, support staff, they're also unionized. And so that teachers' unions, one of those mixed incentives might be to funnel more money towards those who are typically lower paid employees and getting them, to become union members. They're less likely to become union members than teachers' unions. This seems like a conflict of interest for unions as they're negotiating for teacher salaries.
Yeah, I'm not really sure why there would be, for example, you see AFT throwing their weight and endorsing all sorts of unions that might not be even directly related to K-12 education, but in addition to that, are employees that are kind of competing over the same pot of funds. Is that kind of your point, David?
Well, that sometimes happens very directly. So, for instance, in Connecticut, they negotiate their pension benefits, and the first union to the table basically gets the best deal because they eat up the biggest chunk. The last one to the table is going to have a hard time getting the same deal. But I mean more like, when they both come in front of the school board on a very local level, the school board has to make some funding decisions on salaries directly. And those salaries, there is a fixed pot for that as well.
I think there's just a general, they feel like they're all in the same boat, I guess I'll say. And on top of that, I think that growing the strength of employees that are non-teaching staff that might have their own recognized bargaining unit is probably good for everybody. So that is one incentive that teachers' unions might have to throw their endorsement behind hiring more non-instructional staff. But also their priorities as far as raising salaries are a little mixed as well, because as is commonly noted, unions are more concerned about, or are mostly concerned about, their more senior members. And so broad-based raises might largely go to a transient subsection of the teaching workforce. So we know from federal data that teacher turnover has been 6, 7, 8% over the last 3 or 4 decades. It's pretty consistent. And even during the pandemic, it hasn't changed a lot. So what that means is that teachers' unions are aware that a lot of the more junior members of a teaching workforce is not going to be in their union, if they are at all, in 5 or 10 years, I think at 5 years, it's almost half that have left the profession altogether. And so that's another kind of, I wouldn't say perverse incentive, but they're not going to be as concerned with representing that transient subsection of their workforce.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. It's also reflected in a lot of the pension systems where pensions, one doesn't vest in the system for a long period of time, so that teachers, many of the younger teachers, never really even get that benefit. The one that the unions are diverting some of the instructional pay to support.
Right. And the compensation arc for teachers is very different than the compensation arc of somebody in the private sector. I mean, a lot of the benefits are concentrated towards the end of their career rather than steadily arcing up. So they're, again, I would like tentatively comparing them to similarly educated workers, underpaid for a lot of their career, and then overpaid towards the end and into retirement. And so that's because of the structure of largely of these pension systems and post-employment benefits.
I find that really interesting. There's a legal duty called the duty of fair representation that unions are supposed to owe to their members, not just the members, anybody in the bargaining unit. And it's sort of like a fiduciary duty. They have to act in their best interest. They can't do so unreasonably. They have to think through things. And it's always struck me as near impossible for a large teachers union to represent every member of the bargaining unit equally when there are structures that reward teachers who've been there for a longer period of time. It seems like that would be a violation of the duty of fair representation to basically throw the younger teachers under the bus. But of course they do it all the time. Maybe even worse when you've got these non-teaching staff that are unionized and they're actually competing as two separate bargaining units. How does a union maintain that?
I think there's got to be, and I'll be honest, I haven't seen a great explanation of why districts and unions have the incentives that they do, the revealed incentives, as revealed by the data that I went through at the beginning. It does seem like they're not representing their more junior members or the more junior members of the workforce particularly well. Again, all I can point to is, I think that the turnover rate being pretty stable is one reason why they might just favor those senior members, because they have been loyal over a long period of time. But there's also the built-in structure, which is the salary step schedule that most school districts use. I think because there are built-in raises based on education and experience, there might not be as much focus on raising the actual average teacher's salary, because they can say, hey, if you stay in this district for 10 years, by that point, you'll be making $70,000 a year or something like that. So I think the salary schedule also can cloud maybe even the demands of actual union members, because they know they're going to elevate a step every year that they stay.
Yeah, Christian's talking about in the collective bargaining agreement, if you flip to towards the end, there'll be what they might refer to as a step schedule or steps and ladders that show how much a teacher can make over a period of time, depending on their level and how long they've been with the school district. Things are pretty well orchestrated so that a teacher will know well ahead of time what they can expect to be making. And you're right, maybe that allows some younger teachers to look ahead and give the union credit for raising other teachers' salaries, given that they're on track to receive it eventually. Here's another idea, though, Christian. Many public sector unions receive dues as a percentage of an employee's pay, but the National Education Association, their state and local affiliates, operate on a different system. I hadn't thought about this before, but instead of receiving a percentage of someone's salary, they just get a flat rate. So that I don't know that it matters to the union beyond keeping its monopoly over the bargaining unit. It doesn't necessarily matter to the union what people are making, at least not immediately.
Yeah, I never thought about that. So you're saying that they get a flat rate, so their dues or their fees are disconnected from what an actual member is making? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, unless you factor in the one's ability to pay. But if they can get it out of someone's paycheck over each month, the amount is probably going to be unseen by the employee.
I'll add too, like I was saying this earlier, that states that have lower union density, and there are exceptions in both directions. I'll say there are right to work states, like I noted, like Nebraska is second behind Massachusetts. They have, for every new dollar they devote to education, 32 cents go to instructional salaries. So states with less union presence, it doesn't mean they can't do a good job of driving money into the classroom. But what I'll add is that I think districts, whether they're bargaining with the union or not, have nearsighted incentives to add marginal staff as opposed to giving broad-based raises. I think it's because families and district residents can see more readily the effects of, say, lower class sizes or more counselors. Whereas if you just give teachers a raise, in your district, even if it's a remarkable raise, you still have the same people teaching in your district, and it doesn't translate immediately to classroom benefits. I mean, presumably a teacher that is making, say, $60,000 a year, if they're suddenly the next year making $70,000 a year in salary, are you going to get an immediate return in their effectiveness in the classroom? No. I think the problem with teacher pay is that it's a long run issue. It has to be proactively addressed and planned for at the district level over the medium and long term, if the goal is to ensure that the teaching workforce is highly qualified and talented. But that's long-term planning that I think both district school boards and administrators and unions don't typically factor in. They would rather focus on kind of the immediate sugar high results of adding staff or adding some support services.
That's interesting. And a problem for government, I think more generally, they look at meeting budget for the next year. And if raising taxes is a way to meet the budget, they'll often do it, not thinking about, the possibility that people might start moving out if that's done too frequently or too high of a rate. So if the goal here is to reward teachers, I mean, it's also worth, questioning whether that's a good goal or not. Maybe we want to find teachers who are not incentivized by pay, who are doing it for the love of the field. But putting that aside, if the goal is to reward teachers and not have the money go towards other projects or towards growth in administration or non-instructional staff, how do we change the funding system to do that? And, feel free to tackle that however you want, whether it's local or whether you have to go up to the state level to do it.
Yeah, and I'll caveat my answer to that with a big if. Because what I'm going to suggest here is not something our foundation or myself would necessarily endorse. But basically, if you want to translate the stated priority of state legislators and governors or the president of let's give every teacher a raise to actual raises for teachers, you have to get a lot more prescriptive in your funding system. So what you have to do is, a lot of states have a statewide salary schedule. They would have to beef up that salary schedule and force the hands of districts to say, hey, you need to abide by our new state salary schedule to make sure every teacher gets a raise. You can do another thing which states do to a limited degree, but they would have to do it pretty systematically and for a period of time. You have to earmark funding and say this can only be spent on instructional salaries. That's what you would have to do. Now, that is very difficult for districts to adapt to, and the difficulty will vary based on their funding situation in the state. So a district that, say, doesn't have as much local property tax revenue, that's more dependent on state formula funding, that means that the state is calling more shots in how they do education and do budgeting and staffing than they already were. And that means that districts can't more readily meet respond to these short-term local concerns that they have. But in short, that's what states would have to do. They would have to get more prescriptive with their funding and use other measures such as, say, class size restrictions. They would probably, again, if they want to prioritize dollars for existing teachers, they would probably want to relax their class size restrictions because, of course, if they mandate decreased class sizes, that's going to guarantee more hiring and less money for higher salaries for existing teachers. But, of course, the other thing, too, is states have to take care of any unfunded liability issues that they have, or they have to shore up their pension systems and make sure they're well funded. So in states in that situation, I would say Pennsylvania is definitely in that camp, as well as New Jersey. It's probably going to get worse before it gets better if that's the priority, because first they have to manage their pension systems more effectively so that there is less crowd out of teacher salaries. So like those are the things those are the state levers that can be pulled by state leaders. But again, I'll caution that would pretty severely restrict district autonomy.
Yeah, restrict local decision making. And then you're right, the crowd out that you talked about. I've known some people who've run for school board with the highest ambitions, people who've run businesses with multi-million-dollar budgets, and then they come into the school board thinking that they can remake the budget and change, perhaps even improve teacher salaries, but make cuts elsewhere. And it turns out they have very little wiggle room. Most of the money that's in the budget is already spoken for, and the discretionary spending, there's just not a lot that they can do, and pensions are one of the main reasons for that. The school district is required to make pension payments to keep things afloat, and that often accounts for a huge percentage of the budget.
Right. And so, an ambitious board member would have to start making some tough decisions. And again, depending on the collective bargaining context, they might not be able to do that. So they might say, oh, wow, so the contribution rate that we have to meet for the pension system is pretty high, but maybe we can still raise salaries by taking advantage of attrition, turnover in teaching or in non-teaching positions. That is a very difficult decision to make. Generally, schools like to just continuously add staff. If a position is vacated, getting rid of that position altogether and reshuffling the dollars is a lot easier said than done.
One other item, I've done some work with union represented employees, especially on the school district level. I'd say their main complaint for most of the folks who reach out to me is a complaint about union political spending, or about the union getting involved in projects that they don't support with their money. But the secondary concern for a lot of people, and this includes people who are big fans of unions in general, is that their union isn't really doing a great job. So, and this bears itself out with salaries in particular, because after a long negotiation and then perhaps a strike, or at least threats of striking, the union will come back and say something like, we got you guys a huge raise. You'll be making 2.5% more under this new collective bargaining agreement. And a lot of these teachers will think, 2.5%? I mean, I don't know if that even keeps up with the inflation, depending on the years you're talking about. So there's a personal experience with it. I guess where I'm going with this is, if we're going to have unions, they might as well be focused on increasing teachers' pay. Right? That's what a lot of teachers would tell you. How can we get them more focused on that?
Well, I think the states can restrict the scope of bargaining for unions so that they are not starting to bargain about everything under the sun at their school district, like affordable housing or something like that, like an example that you've seen in Chicago.
So tell me what you mean, the scope of bargaining.
What they can bargain about. So scope, I mean, you have a lot of categories that they can negotiate around. So the main one is wages, but in some states, laws or administrative code will also say you can bargain about benefits, fringe benefits, schedule, working hours, termination, grievances, what positions that districts have to fill. That's the scope that I'm talking about. And depending on the state, the unions can bargain, or the districts have to bargain with unions over more or fewer things on that list that I just went through.
so that the bargaining itself, whatever the incentives are, it's actually diffused over several categories and not just focused on teacher salary. I'll give you a couple of examples of that. I like this concept. A couple of examples of that are some of the union favorites that'll be in nearly every contract you'd see in Pennsylvania or other union stronghold states. Collective bargaining agreement provisions that, for instance, allow the union to get payroll deductions right out of teacher salaries. That's worth money to a union because it would be far more expensive for a union to do it. And relatively speaking, it's cheaper for the employer to offer that because, they're already taking out deductions for insurance, for United Way. To take out another deduction for unions and send a big payment to the unions isn't going to be that expensive for the district. So as a result of that imbalance, the state almost always gives it away to the unions, but in return for lower salary, lower demands elsewhere. Unions are willing, in other words, because of that gap, to pay in the form of lesser salaries for teachers some amount of money to get payroll deductions. That's also true for something like union release time, where some of the union officers get time off. They will pay, or maybe the better word is negotiate away, teacher salaries in return for some of these sort of union subsidies, as Michael Hartney put it, subsidies that make the union easier to run.
Right. So, yeah, those are both great examples. And in a way, you're kind of taking some bargaining chips away from the unions so they can't bargain away salaries. And presumably, that would make them just more laser focused on increasing teacher salaries in general, or implementing broad-based increases to teacher salaries.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. I like thinking about that. Okay, well, thanks for sitting down with us today, Christian. I appreciate the work that you're doing, and hope you'll come back soon.
No problem, David. Thank you so much.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of Disunion, the Government Union Report. We hope you found today's exploration into public sector labor policy both insightful and thought-provoking. Special thanks to all of you for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's discussion and want to stay informed about the latest developments, don't forget to subscribe to Disunion, the Government Union Report, on Spotify or your favorite podcast platform. Your support means the world to us. I'm David R. Osborne, reminding you that understanding labor policy is crucial for shaping the future. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep making a difference.